Hi, Mick McQuaid here with a few words about the contextual inquiry milestone. This is perhaps the most difficult milestone that you'll face in this class. Certainly one of the two most difficult, if not the most difficult. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about how I'm going to evaluate your work on this. First, I should mention that it is very important to get this right. So important that I'm more likely to excuse lateness than poor work. So if you are unable to get the project in on time, and if you're unable to complete this milestone on time, you may want to write to me and request an extension and to tell me why. And it'll become apparent in the next few minutes what I would consider legitimate reasons for why. So the contextual inquiry has several parts to it. First, there is a series of interviews, and then there is an activity known as affinity diagramming. I've been doing this for years and still trip over my words. So what I will see will be the final affinity diagram, or much of what I will see will be the final affinity diagram. And that affinity diagram will consist of a bunch of post-it notes, and they're arranged in a pyramid. And at the top of the pyramid are post-it notes that are refined. At the bottom of the pyramid are many more post-it notes that are atoms. And the process of building the affinity diagram is that you will first create these atomic post-it notes that will form the base of the pyramid, and then you will bubble up from there. You'll group them. Actually, you'll keep moving them around. This is the reason for doing them as post-it notes rather than doing it in another format, is that your group members will stand in front of a wall, put the post-it notes up, see that some are related to others and move them around, even move groups of them around. Should be quite a bit of this moving groups around. And then enunciating a higher level of post-it note based on the lowest level, and yet another level above that. And these are covered in some detail. These levels are covered in some detail in the Holtzblatt book. And they color code them, and there's all kinds of details about putting them together. But the key thing is that there is a process, a kind of bubbling up refinement process that happens from the base of the pyramid through the middle to the themes at the top. And when I first look at your work, I will be looking at the very first thing that I'll be looking at is at the top of the pyramid. And I will go, I'll read stuff at the top of the pyramid, and then I'll look down at the next level, and I'll ask myself if I see a connection between those, if I see a strong connection between what's at the top of the pyramid and what's right below it. That is to say, the themes that have bubbled up from one level to the next. And then I'll go down to the bottom level and see if I see a connection, and eventually I'll be able to tell if there is a path all the way through the pyramid that makes sense to me. Now, you will report also on your interviews. So the atomic level ones, the atomic level notes, are a result of the interviews. And the interviews should not have been conducted more than about 48 hours. They shouldn't have ended more than about 48 hours before the affinity diagramming session, which should be an intensive and lengthy session. And the structure and timing of the interviews is important and difficult. So the interviews have to happen in a tightly clustered space of time, but you shouldn't break up into your group shouldn't break up into individuals and conduct all the interviews at the same time. The interviews should be stacked at least to some extent so that you can meet as a group after the first interview, figure out what went wrong, and improve the second interview, and improve the third interview, and so on. So this creates a huge time crunch for this project. So you have to do a bunch of interviews, and the more interviews, the better. Students are always asking me, what's the minimum number of interviews? And you'll be able to tell from your grade on the project whether you covered the minimum number of interviews. It's very difficult to give a specific number to this, but you should probably do more than you think you're capable of in this amount of time. In fact, it's It's not for you to be late, for you to have been working hard on this the whole time, and to be late on it wouldn't be unusual, and that's better than submitting something that's terrible. So you have this series of interviews that have to happen in a short period of time, but there has to be enough separation between them that you are able to improve your interview technique as you go along, so that the interviews form a rich material from which to obtain the post-it notes that form the atoms in the affinity diagramming process. And then after the interviews end, there will be a period that should not be more than 48 hours before you do the affinity diagramming. Otherwise, you will lose quite a bit of what you've done. It's just inevitable. Many years of experience suggest that you have to do the affinity diagramming process very soon after that, and that the affinity diagramming process should be done in a long session. You should meet as a group and plan to spend a long time generating the atomic level post-it notes, and then letting your ideas bubble up from there. So the evidence that I will see that you have not done a good job usually is when I glance at the post-it notes and I see that there aren't very many. I think, oh no, this is going to be painful. It is usually the case that if I see a small number of post-it notes, that a poor grade will inevitably follow. But that's a symptom. And by covering the symptoms, you may not get to the root of a problem. So the next thing that I do is look at the top level post-it notes and see if they make sense. And usually, if something went wrong in this process, they won't make sense. The connections between them and the next level also won't make sense. And in fact, this is one of the reasons why you have to have a lot of post-it notes, because the more post-it notes you have, the more likely there is to be a connection. If there are only a few post-it notes, the connections will be very tenuous. The connections from one level to the level above it will be very tenuous if there isn't very much material to support it. Just as if there were not many blocks supporting a pyramid, the whole thing would fall apart. If your interviews were clumsy, there won't be that many. There won't be nearly as many atomic post-it notes as there should be. And the post-it notes that you have won't be very good, because if your interview is clumsy, you won't have figured out how to elicit what you need from your interviewees. Remember that your interviewees don't know what it is that you need. They're simply going to respond to your interviews. They're simply going to try to help you, but they don't really know what you need. You have to guide them. And if you don't guide them, you'll fail. You won't get good post-it notes, and you won't get enough post-it notes. So it's not just a question of quantity. There's also a question of quality. Now, there are a number of things that you can do to improve the interview process. Not everyone agrees about these things. So some people claim that you should have 2 group members present for the interview, and that only one of those group members should interact with the interviewee, and the other one should take notes. Some people disagree with that. They say that having 2 people facing the interviewee is intimidating. You have to make your decision about which of those sides you want to take, or you may want to try both. You have more than one interview, so you can easily try both methods and see what you think works better. Another thing that people disagree about in the interview process is whether or not you should use a recording device. I don't think that you should use a recording device. I have a lot of recording devices. I love recording devices. I've conducted many interviews using recording devices, and they have never been a significant help. They're not even remotely as useful as I wish they were, because I just like them. I enjoy gadgets, or I used to enjoy gadgets anyway, and it would be nice if they were helpful, but I don't really think they are. There is one thing that I've found positive about them. If I take a device and put it in the middle of the table, preferably a cell phone these days, a smartphone these days, that has a very big pause button on it and a very obvious record button, and I can put it on the table between me and the interviewee, and I tell the interviewee that if they want to say something off the record, they're welcome to press the pause button at any time. Whenever I've done that, it is inevitable that at some point during the interview, almost inevitable that at some point during the interview, they will press the pause button. And that's when the interview gets interesting. And once they've pressed the pause button, they never unpress it. And don't ask them if it's okay to unpress it now. Because what will have happened in that moment is you will have formed a tighter bond with the interviewee. When that moment when they pressed the pause button and they told you something off the record, your relationship with them will have improved. And if you say, okay, now can we go back on the record, the magic will vanish in a puff of nothingness. So that's an advantage. That's a value of the recording device. Even if there's nothing, even if there's no memory card there, just the psychological use of it to make things better. That's quite important. It's also very, very useful to take notes, even if you're just scribbling on the paper. If you take a few notes during the interview, and particularly if you do it in a way that the other person can see it. Obviously, if you're scribbling, you don't want the person to see it. It's better to write actual words that they can see. That will improve your relationship with them, and it may help your memory. I do find taking notes to be helpful, and I'm in the camp that believes that you should have one person taking notes on paper, and one person conducting the interview. And the notes should always be written on the table as close to the interviewee as possible, so that they don't feel that anything is being kept from them. I think those are important guidelines to follow. But not everyone agrees about this, and you'll find in the Holzblatt book advice about conducting the interviews. And in many other, so if you just Google the term contextual inquiry, you'll find that although I think Holzblatt's partner coined the term, many other people use it or use variations of it, and have lots of conflicting ideas about how to do it, which may work for them. I'm not so concerned about that as I'm concerned that you do the interviews in a sequence where there's some improvement as you go from one interview to the next, so that you have some strong interview material, that you have a lot of strong interview material, and that the affinity diagramming process happens soon enough and is intensive enough after the interview process that you're able to generate an adequate supply of atomic level notes to support a structure, and that the structure makes sense, that you spend enough time in analysis for your conclusions to make sense. So this is kind of an overview. It is not meant to contradict anything that I've said in the lecture notes. If there are contradictions in the lecture notes to this, either you should obey the lecture notes or bring it to my attention, and I'll either revise the lecture notes or make a note that I said something wrong in this. This is not a very precise method, and there are times when I contradict myself, and times when I change my opinion. Times you have to let experience make you somewhat flexible about how you go about these kinds of things. Contextual inquiry is ideal, and it's a very well understood process for getting information about very typical, well understood processes. This is not something that you can use in an exotic context. So there are limits. There are certainly a lot of limits, and a lot of the best work that happens cannot be done using contextual inquiry. But you should be exposed to it because there are so many things that HCI professionals can do with it, and you should do it right. It's very important to me that you do it right. This is the milestone where we'll probably see the lowest grades of the semester, because no matter what we do, some people are just going to struggle with it. But good luck.